trade press. So we ask that you respect that. Second, there are copies of the presentation material along with cards with Wi-Fi password and security room codes on the back table, and they should have been sent out electronically when you got your confirmation yesterday. For those of you on the phone, you should be able to access it there. Third, this presentation has been approved for CLE credit in Pennsylvania, California, New York, and Virginia. For those of you here in person, there are copies of the certificate of attendance you should fill out and retain if required by your state. And there's also CLE sign-in form by the front desk. For those of you attending electronically, I don't think EBA circulated the form, so you'd need to contact EBA, or you can send me an email at brian@rightlaw.com, and I'll try and get the forms out to you. But either one of those should work. Calling EBA should work, like I said. Fourth, questions and comments from the audience, including those participating electronically, are encouraged, so you should feel to ask any questions or raise comments at any time. For those of you on the webcast, my understanding is that you can ask questions by clicking the chat function, which should be located somewhere on the screen. And we have somebody here monitoring, so she'll just ask the questions that you sent to us. Fifth, for those of you here in person, we have food and desserts and so forth in the back, so please help yourself. Okay, so if everybody's said, and hopefully everybody on the listening on the webcast is ready, we're going to get started in just another minute. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Lonnie, who will then speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Then Jonathan will speak. As a senior manager of cyber and physical security assurance at NERC, Lonnie is responsible for directing programs and processes necessary to monitor, review, and evaluate programs and processes necessary, evaluate critical infrastructure protection program effectiveness at NERC. His responsibilities include collaborating and coordinating activities with other program areas within NERC and industry to support the risk-based approach, identifying emerging cyber and physical security risks, and ensuring adherence to NERC rules of practice and procedure. So without any more, Lonnie, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Dave.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Once again, my name's Lonnie Ratliff. I'm Senior Manager, Cyber and Physical Security Assurance, and pretty much what Dave says, that me and my team, we're responsible. We're responsible for SIP and physical, cyber and physical compliance across the ERO enterprise, and that includes all the 7 regions, soon to be 6. So for those who don't know, it's going down to 6 regions. I usually start with a joke, but usually a lawyer joke. I was informed not to do that this time, but no, they said I'd have to explain it many times, so I only got 30 minutes, so I think I'll move forward. Next slide. You know, my responsibilities include a lot of compliance, SIP compliance, security, and not many times do we actually look at why we tie in the compliance into actual security risks. Anybody familiar with Marriott? It was released on the last day. Marriott breached 500 million users. Dunkin' Donuts was released yesterday. That was what, 2.4 million, something like that. They've been hacked. I recently got a notice, I think yesterday or today, about a third-party provider for my health care. They've been hacked. So our information is out there. Many people in our industry says, hey, that's not our industry. That's not the power. That's not the grid. You know, we keep talking about these cybersecurity costs and looking across all this organization, but it won't happen to us. Well, you know, if you look at the cybersecurity why, you know, ransomware attacks every 40 seconds in 2016. You know, what's the significance of that? Well, $500 to $2,000 on every one of those that people pay up to get their data back. You do the math, every 40 seconds going down to every 14 seconds in 2019. That's a great business model. You know, if you can jump into a business model and get $500, $2,000 every, you know, even the success rate of 10%, you know, you'll see that there's a lot of money being spent out there for cybersecurity. We're talking about ransomware, $75 billion per year. And this is just across all these industries, you know, and later we'll see that it happens on the grid, and we'll get in the next slide in a minute. But we have a lessons learned where it actually happened to one of our assets on the BES. We have a lessons learned that covers that. But when we talk about cybersecurity costs for annually across the world, $6 trillion in 2021, $3 trillion in 2015. We throw around trillion, million, billion like nothing. We talk about all these costs, but has anybody ever really thought about it? $1 trillion. When I've gave this presentation several times. $1 trillion, you've got to spend, I think, $10 million a day for like 273 years. So I gave that number to my wife, and she's like, I'll take a challenge, And no. But another way to look at it, a trillion seconds takes you back to what, 30,000 BC, somewhere around there. A billion takes you back to about 1987. I read that number on the internet, so take for what it's worth. But so when you start talking about the compromises, the Marriott's, the Dunkin' Donuts, and then we start looking at how is it impacting our industry, the power industry, and then we start talking about the LSI breach. For those people that are not aware, OSI was breached. It's out publicly now that, and there was a TLP Green briefing yesterday from EISAC, and their domain admin accounts were breached. So any power company, example PG&M, that may use OSI was at risk. So we're starting to see more and more impact on the power grid publicly. Next slide. And as we go in, this is where it starts to tie into the power grid. Is we have a lesson learned document out there, the risk of internet accessible cyber assets. That's the title of it. There was a compromised system on the public internet that was brute force hacked. For people that don't know what brute force means, that means there was a default account, default password, and someone just sat there and tried all these passwords until they eventually got the password. It may have been password one. We always use those lists on the internet of the most common passwords. Where there's tools out there that will just sit there and continually try any of these default passwords. If you search internet, Google default passwords, there'll be lists that get loaded in, and you can have tools. You don't even have to sit in front of the system. It just sits there and try all this for you and eventually tell you, hey, we're in the system. So it had a default account, weak password. Luckily, it was at a low impact facility. It was compromised for 7 months before the utility was aware of it. 7 months it was sitting there, and they were using it for mail relaying and actually remote desktop scanning. So, this device, it was controlling a capacitor bank at a low impact facility. And, it appears that whoever compromised it did not know what they had. They were looking, they put ransomware on it. I think ransomware was put on it twice, but they didn't know who to notify. Of course, you don't know who to notify until you log in and try to utilize the device. But people weren't using this because some people didn't know it. It was actually there. So what was interesting is the IP address and credentials, even though it had ransomware on a couple of times, was out on a Russian social media site. No surprise there, right? So when people start seeing these compromises of all these companies out in the corporate world, and they're like, oh, well, it's not happening to us. It is happening to us. Do we know? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. Does it get covered up? Do we want this on the New York Times that the grid's at risk? Because that's a news article, right? That one system was hacked, even though it was low, the grid has been compromised. That's all you'll see. That's all people will read. In fact, that lessons learned out there, if you don't go out and read lessons learned, it's a great one to start talking about and looking at. So next slide. So how does it tie into where we're going with the FERC orders? Dave talked about the FERC order, and the first one we want to talk about is FERC Order 829, the supply chain. For those who don't know, it's around protecting the supply chain and having that process secured up. So, you know, when we talk about one device out on the public internet that was brute force attacked, you know, what about supply chain? What if I could get into hundreds of devices without even trying to compromise it? Compromising that supply chain. For those who may follow cybersecurity, I don't know if you read the Bloomberg report from about a month, 2 months ago, 3 months ago. I'm not going to debate its merits or not, but they say there's a little chip on the processing board. You know, if it's true, it's true. If it's not, it's not. But it's about the concept. If you could get that chip on a board and get it compromised, and you get into hundreds or thousands of devices instead of one without even really spending the time to get into it, you know, that's where the risk is. You know, luckily, on this one lessons learned, they didn't know what they had, but if you get in the supply chain, I think there's people out there that would love to be able to get into thousands of devices across our grid and maybe not take it down. I mean, I spoke to Dave and Daniel earlier. You know, the money may not be in taking the blackout. I mean, yeah, that's a news article. But what if you can get into the market databases, start manipulating the markets, taking money out of the markets, the settlements? You know, you get a little bit here and there. It ain't about the blackout. It's about getting that money supporting the other activities. I mean, it's there. I mean, it's possible if you get in a supply chain. The FERC order, of course, was issued back in July 2016. The standard's been approved in 2017. We finally got FERC approval. Final rule will be effective next month, December 26th, mandatory and enforceable on July 1, 2020 in the United States. You know, supply chain, for those who are not aware, the FERC order set out to create a mandatory standard requirement, SIP 13. And many in industry call that a due diligence standard. It is about having a plan, process, procedures in place, working with your supply vendors to get notified of possible incidents or weaknesses of their product. This is one of the things I mentioned to Daniel and Dave, that you work through these contracts. What's the recourse if the utility gets compromised and OSI knew that weakness was there? And if you use a private utility, what's the harm to their reputation that they've been compromised? What's the recourse to go back? I mean, they said they was going to do something. That's something that I think, I'm a cybersecurity person. I'm just trying to secure stuff. I let the lawyers worry about what they're going to do if something happens and somebody breaks a contract. So I'm just curious what some of the thoughts around how the recourse around breaches could possibly be handled after 2020 once this comes into effect. Next slide. So one of the things that FERC required in that order was a supply chain risk study. NERC used EPRI. They went out and looked at all the data that we had of our BES cyber systems across the country. Did analysis, looked at best practice standards, approaches, looked at vendors, and we engaged, EISAC. We're looking with the EISAC and Department of Homeland, Department of Energy, and DHS to look at how industry and NERC, EISAC can be notified of supply chain risks. This risk study, if you haven't went out and read it, it's pretty alarming about some of the numbers. And some of the numbers, you can look at it from several different ways. If you go to the next slide, if we go into the highlights, we're talking about the supply chain. We're talking about like substation networking equipment. 2 vendors own 55% of that market share. 55%. So you figure there's several 100,000 BES cyber systems out there. You compromise 2 vendors' supply chain. That could be a big risk.
Well, I had a question. Do you think you were better off with just having a really small number of vendors, because then they're a lot easier to police and they're a lot easier to hack, or vice versa? If you got
that's a great lead-in. Exactly, because that's the downfall to it. Because some people look at it and say, "Oh, 2 vendors, we secure those 2 supply chains, we're good." But then if you look at that from the compromise side, if you compromise 2 supply vendors, you got a large number. So which is better? I mean, it's you know, you got to look at that, and we'll get that in a few slides. Is, you know, our RTUs, the remote terminal units, there's 5 vendors that have less than 20% market share. So as a utility, you may have multiple vendors for that RTUs, but you got to deal with multiple supply chains. But if you have one, then you only have to deal with that one. But you know, it's risk.
Because I mean, I assume like those vendors don't necessarily make 100% of their own parts.
Probably no.
So, I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to find one.
Yep.
Right.
And that goes into the CIP 13, the supply chain mandatory standards, is you're working with your supply chain vendor. Where does that supply chain vendor get their parts from? So if there's a chip on the Cisco device or Palo Alto device, and they get notified of a vulnerability on that chip, you know, does it trickle down to the utility? And that's some of the risks that there are out there that, you know, maybe Johnson can expand on that later, but see how they're handling that. But, you know, I think we're starting to get there. And I think a lot of people look at the CIP 13, the mandatory standard, as a start to start securing some of that supply chain. So, look, you know, if you look at the operating system, there's one vendor that's 87% of the market share. And that probably doesn't take much to realize probably who that vendor may be.
I can guess.
So if you think about 87%, I mean, that's one large channel. And, you know, we're talking about supply chain. We're not talking necessarily just parts. We're not talking about hardware. We're talking about maybe it's a patch. Maybe it's just a firmware update. You know, a patch that is fixing, you know, I use quotes, fixing something that could put an exploit in all these operating systems. You got 87%, we're talking about maybe 300,000-400,000 systems. That's a lot of devices out there that all of a sudden that may be phoning home. I think it was released maybe a month or two ago. You know, there was devices that were out, maybe not in our industry, that the network team started noticing all this connectivity going back to China because they just upgraded their systems to this new hardware. And of course they were blocking it, but they were like, what's this going on? And all of a sudden they notified their vendor and says, hey, you know, what's going on? They're like, oh, well, that's a phone home feature. That's a feature.
The feature.
Yeah, not a bug. So y'all caught that. And, you know, things like that happen, but, you know, if you're not doing your due diligence with your network security, some people never know that's happening. I mean, you know, in our industry, there's mandatory standards, and some of that is around network about ingress and egress traffic. And Jonathan might go into this later. And they wonder why we're so adamant about protecting not only inbound connections, but outbound connections. If you don't know what's going on, you may have data leaks everywhere. I mean, you look at financial institutions, they all have this data loss prevention, DLP, about everything that's going out. I mean, you may have locks on USBs. Hey, we went down that path with our critical infrastructure. So if you don't know what's going out, then you just don't know if you're being exposed or not. Next slide. So this expands more on what they were bringing up is one vendor no more than 20% of the market. So when you look at that, you're like, oh, that's pretty good. But then again, there's more ways in, right? So do you want one large door? Do you want 20 doors coming in? And then EMS vendors, 2 vendors, approximately 60% of the market share. And when we talk about the OSI breach, I don't know if OSI was one of those 2 vendors, but they could have been.
Yeah, there's 2, OSI EMS, or EMS, and then OSI Soft. OSI Soft was the breach, not the EMS. Two different companies, but a totally important distinction.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to relate, you know, 2 vendors controlling the EMS vendors. When you go across our country, there's over 1,400 utilities that are registered with NERC, and you started talking about whether the BA TOPs may have this EMS system, so you knock that number down several hundred. but still 60% of that, you start compromising 60% of 400, instead of attacking one device at a time. The risk for supply chain is there. We just got to realize how to secure that, how to move forward, and make sure that we can close some of those gaps. And I'm open to questions anytime. I don't know if Dave mentioned that. Next slide. So some of the other SIP modifications, we talked about supply chain, and then, I didn't know the audience, but I want to mention that, I think Jonathan's going to get into all the mandatory compliance standards that we have. And, we're continually trying to update them. I think on his slide, he mentions that we're not moving as quick as our adversaries. He may be right. It's difficult to write compliance standards, get them industry approved, NERC approved, FERC approved, and then stay up with technology. Technology is moving at a pace a lot faster than a lot of compliance standards can move. We can agree that. But can you use technology and still meet the existing standards? Yes. It's very difficult, but depends on what you're trying to do. Some of the modifications are Project 2016-02. That's to allow virtualization. We're seeing more and more people wanting to use managed service providers, putting stuff in the cloud. There's a lot of changes coming around. If you don't know, SIP 4 is around personnel and access. SIP 5 is around networks, network-based, inbound, outbound connections. Currently, everything has to be in what they call an electronic security perimeter. We equate that to a pasture with cows in it, and you have a gate. That's your gateway into the see the cows. Well, we're moving to a more diverse technology to where you don't want to protect the whole pasture, you want to protect the cows, so you put the security controls closer to the resource. So, you control where that cow may go or whatever, but you don't have to secure the whole pasture. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You don't want wandering cows. That's a bad thing.
Exactly. Maybe a bad analogy, but I'll try to break it down. And then there's a lot of definition changes. If you're around in the mandatory standards of SIP, the 15-minute impact is something that we have. If there's a 15-minute impact on a BS cyber system, it's included. So they're looking to possibly modify some of the definitions, but that 15-minute impact will still be there. And then Project 2018-02 is the cybersecurity incident reporting. I think the first formal comment concluded on October 22nd. The second draft version went out, or the second version went out. Formal comment period ended, I think, yesterday, the 29th. I think the SDT and NERC's looking through those comments now. There's some meetings scheduled for next week. So I think there was a lot of modifications. I'm curious to see how those come out. And for both of these projects out on the NERC website, if you've ever been to the NERC website, it's very easy to navigate. You go.
You bet it is.
You go out there. There's presentations on both of these projects about the modifications and the FERC order and how they're meeting some of that FERC order. Next slide. So like I said, on Project 2016-02, there's new terminology, removing the electronic security perimeter, focus on isolation. With new technology, you'll hear isolation in diverse networks. Without getting too far down the weeds, networks, you can deploy a lot of logical controls that doesn't necessarily require physical devices. So they're looking to really focus on the isolation, to use technologies around virtualization, cloud computing, things like that. One of the key things that they're looking to do is make sure there's backwards capability. We've got industry that spent a lot of money getting SIP version 3 compliant. There was big changes to SIP version 5, so we want to make sure that they don't have to spend a lot of money moving forward. They can still utilize their environment, move forward as their technology, allows them with their IT programs. Next slide, 2802. That's FERC Order 848. That's the cybersecurity instance. There was 4 things that was elements that FERC required. You can read them on the screen. You can see them. The key thing is there that a lot of people have, you know, not concerns, but have thought about is cyber incident reports directly to the EASAC and the Department of Homeland Security, ICS cert. That's a little bit change from where we are now. We got, you know, cybersecurity incidents covered under other mandatory standards, SIP 8, and those typically come in through OE 417 forms to NERC, and they get processed like that, like an event. This is a little bit different. Go to EASAC, so this is where they're trying to group in industry and seeing the broad issue, a holistic view across all of industry, not just one-off.
So I was curious about that. In the final rule, FERC said one of the problems was that they thought that cybersecurity incidents was massively underreported. And I think they said, like, I don't remember, 2015 to 2016, but just in 2 years there was nothing. So I mean, are you expecting real? And what they did in the rules basically expand what you need to report.
Yeah.
So are you anticipating a big jump in reporting? Do you think was it woefully inadequate before? I mean, some of it is, I assume, the amount of attacks has also just increased with time.
Well, this is my thoughts around cybersecurity incidents. And you got to remember, utility, the people working in utility is very smart, and you want your systems isolated from the internet. So when you start talking about defense and depth, a lot of what FERC wants is there, that some of these networks are so far down, there's not going to be many attempts on those networks. But with the new FERC order, I think there's going to be an increase, but I don't think it's going to jump like people may think. You know, that's an observation. You know, as our role, we do oversight of the region's performance audits. And we may have seen on two hands, myself, on two hands, how many industry participants have had CSI, cybersecurity incidents. And it's because they bury that network so far down, you got to get into the corporate network, and you got to go through some other DMZs to get to the EMS network, to the network that actually matters. So there's so many filters and firewalls and IDS before you ever get there that there may be a jump, but a majority of industries protected their environment so far down that you're not going to see it as much.
Right. Jonathan, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, but I think I would say that with some of the updates, SIP 5 is an example. What we've seen is certainly an increase in self-reports of things that are compliance related. And those are really more about kind of the blocking and tackling of how we, you know, our production environment and the types of things that we're doing on our corporate networks. I would say from a pure cybersecurity incident reporting standpoint, you know, the number that you use, two hands, is really an accurate one. So I don't necessarily think that we will see a dramatic increase in cybersecurity incident reporting per se. But I do think that whenever any new standards come out, it creates new categories of things from a compliance perspective that need to be considered and reported. So I think we'll see that trend line go up overall. But ultimately, from a cybersecurity incident standpoint, I'm curious myself to kind of see how it's going to go because of the layering or network segmentation and the types of things that we do to protect kind of the crown jewels of the energy management system. I think that'll be more driven by the advancement of tools and technologies of adversaries than anything else.
And what's interesting, go ahead.
The question that I had was my understanding that the reporting created a certain amount of anonymity when the information was turned over. Has there been discussion about how to still protect? I mean, obviously you want to know where the issues are so you can provide support, but there's also either a stigma or various other things that clients are concerned about. How are we squaring, I guess, those two parts of how are you balancing those two parts of the equation?
Well, what's interesting is you see this reported to the EASAC, and some people think
the shield a little bit?
that is a shield. And I'll tell you right now, the code of conduct we have between the EASAC and NERC compliance is there's a wall there. There's nothing that they can send me that I can take action on. Okay. They don't contact me about any compliance concerns or anything like that. Now, with the mandatory standard, we will look and see to make sure they're reporting it. But if they're working with the EASAC, we can't work with them on compliance matters. It just.
I think it's fair to say that's one of the biggest challenges from an industry perspective is that if it falls outside of mandatory reporting requirements, you have to make a decision as to whether or not, how open you want to be about whatever breach or challenge that you ran into. You're obviously going to meet your statutory obligations for what you need to do, but there's already precedent out there for things that were reported to the EISAC or to the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. The Burlington, Vermont example from 2 years ago is the first thing that comes to mind, which was, there was a report issued based on potentially compromised IP addresses that was provided to utilities. A utility in Vermont detected that there was one of those IP addresses had communicated with their network at some point, and that was the level of detail that they reported. And then within a matter of hours, it was on the news that a US-based utility had been breached by a foreign adversary, which is not actually indicative of what happened. And so the development of that trust relationship, What? I know, it's true. Headlines never lie. You're definitely right about that. And those are the kind of those trust-based issues. If you're really going to fall back and be assured that somebody's going to catch you, it's important to make sure that reporting happens even outside of the regular compliance requirements, because I'm a believer in the bumper sticker that says it may be that the purpose of your life is to serve as a warning to others, right? Like you need to be able to communicate this stuff, because the odds are, taking those supply chain type vulnerabilities into consideration, you're not the only one that's using that software or is potentially exposed to that vulnerability. And the sooner you can notify people, you want to make sure that you foster this environment of trust and communication, and not your compliance is going to come in with a stick and hit you with it. And that's the firewall, right? Of saying, like, I'm not taking action on this. I want to encourage people to report, because it could potentially stave off much larger issues.
And I think that's one of the reasons they went to the ISAC, because we feed them information all the time. We never get anything back from them. Never. And I sign a thing every year says I can't take anything from them.
Right.
Well, that kind of suggests another question that I'd be curious about, and that is, to what extent is DHS driving the industry security programs at all, or is DHS just taking in information from the industry about what you're doing to secure that?
You might be better to answer that.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that one. So I would say there's a little bit of both. So one of the biggest challenges is that utilities don't necessarily have the level of access to classified or high-side intelligence that we need in order to develop the necessary procedures or protections for our system, or at least as much as we would like to have, which DHS obviously has access to. So in so much as they can provide that kind of risk targeting, or those type, whether it's indicators of compromise or supply chain vulnerabilities, whatever they have access to from the intelligence community that they can provide, is certainly helpful in driving how we secure our system. So to a certain degree, yes. That's the primary role of the EISAC, the Electricity Information Sharing and Analysis Center, because I know we've used the acronym a couple of times. But ideally what they're doing is they're reviewing that high-side intelligence, and they're establishing what we call tear lines to basically say, out of what I just saw, I will remove the classified information, but provide a shareable version of this that we can use for that. So that's the stated purpose. I would say that there are instances where that's been effective, and there have been instances where it's not. And so the level of access within the industry is generally challenged just because of the authorizing agencies for clearances. Now, in some instances, I'm an Army reservist, so I have a top secret clearance sponsored by the Department of Defense, and I happen to work at a utility company. That in and of itself is valuable, but that's not the norm.
Information you wouldn't otherwise get?
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. The hard part is how much can you communicate it?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right? So you get it and you say, okay, I know this terrible thing, but what can I really say about it?
We're at risk. We're at risk.
Yeah, we're at risk, everybody. We're in trouble.
Chicken little.
Exactly. So it really takes, building out the ecosystem of support within your organization to be able to do it. At this point now, we have more people beyond myself who have security clearances, not necessarily at the top secret level, but still with clearances in hand. We've built out some infrastructure to be able to support classified level conversations occurring at our own facility, which in and of itself is largely unique within the industry. But it takes time. It takes a lot of time to build those things out. And the time component associated with how actionable intelligence is and when it needs to be implemented, let's just say it doesn't it doesn't wait for all of those support mechanisms or improvements to be able to be made in order to address it.
I imagine a lot of times you don't know how much time you have to.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no way to understand, especially when you look at what Lonnie said about how long it takes to detect breaches and that kind of thing.
Well, that's the thing. A lot of times in cybersecurity in general, when you find out, it's already too late.
It's over.
I mean, it's too late. You're in recovery mode. But, going back to one point on this, the one thing that the CSIs, the cybersecurity incidents cover now that they didn't cover is your EACMs. That's your electronic access control and monitoring systems. So before it primarily covered the critical systems. Now it's actually covering the systems that control access to those systems. And I think that's where the reporting is actually going to go up, because those systems typically sit on the corporate network, on a DMZ, and they're protected, they're required to be protected, but they're typically not protected to the level that the BES systems are protected at.
Yep.
So that's where you're going to start to see the increase. You're going to see network redesigns to put more protection in around those devices. And, we look to see, how do you drive behavior of industry? FERC order, mandatory standards, that's how you drive behavior, and the ultimate goal is to protect it, not necessarily just get reporting, right?
Right.
So this just driving behavior is the way I look at it.
This is one thing I'm curious, but I read a couple of years ago that the sort of the utility control systems, like over the power lines or the generators, are either totally or fairly separate from your standard business systems like word processing and so forth. So, wondering, is that accurate? And secondly, does NERC have oversight over, the non-utility systems? I assume you'd be concerned if you start hacking passwords and stuff like that. But
We don't have oversight of the corporate world.
mm-hmm.
And that's where we talked about a few minutes ago about the defense in depth. We focus on the systems that have 15-minute impact on the BES, bulk electric system, bulk power system, whatever you want to call it. Now, what we're seeing is with virtualization and using more technologies, they might start bringing in more of the corporate world because they started using the shared infrastructure type environment. So if they're not using the shared infrastructure, that's out of scope. I'll use an example. PJM's corporate world may be hacked. Yeah, it's a concern to us, but we're not going, we might come in when we do a compliance monitoring engagement and say, okay, how are you preventing this? How do you ensure compliance and security and reliability? It's not necessarily we want to ensure compliance. We want to ensure security and reliability. Now, compliance is a way to demonstrate that. So we'll come in and say, hey, we know your corporate rules environment. That's all out of scope for us. And how did you make sure, what controls did you have in place to ensure it was isolated from your BS network? Mm-hmm. And that's what we'll look at. And those are the controls that we'll start to ask about. Many people think that it's completely out of scope, but, we'll ask questions. We can ask questions around how you perform that isolation.
It runs the gamut from an asset owner operator perspective, right?
Yeah.
So the relative sophistication of the protective, how they design their system from an architecture standpoint, being able to implement full network segmentation, to your point, that none of this stuff, not even just the separation of the corporate networks and the operating networks for the energy management system, but all of these subsegments of network to make sure that wherever the vulnerability is exposed, you may exploit a vulnerability that is related to printers, but from that point, all you can do is bounce around inside a tiny room. And then if you want to go anywhere else, you have to pass through a locked door to get there and another opportunity to detect. That's great at a high level of sophistication, but as was mentioned earlier, there are literally thousands of utility companies out there that might not have the necessary resources to have that robust of safety systems. So it really runs the gamut, but the idea, to your point, is trying to establish that baseline of how we approach it.
Somewhat kind of related point to a couple issues you've raised, Lonnie, in terms of the corporate world, and then kind of the examples you're giving at the beginning of your presentation, whether it be financial institutions or, Fortune 500 companies. Are there, I think we think of those perhaps because they make the headlines as being the target for more cybersecurity attempts as opposed to the energy industry. But are there lessons learned there that the industry could benefit from, or is it just too different and more of an awareness raising type of exercise.
In my opinion, oftentimes there are lessons learned, because if you look at the Marriott hack, the Marriott talks about their database being compromised. I haven't looked at all the details, but many times it comes down to systems not being patched or firewalls being wide open. And those are issues that our mandatory SIP standards cover. And if you don't implement those mandatory standards and requirements, then you're going to leave those systems open. A lot of times it comes down to as simple as a patch not being installed on one device. And they get in through that one door, and all of a sudden they're on the inside, and people are like, oh, if you're through that trusted door, you're good.
Mm-hmm.
And then they never know you're even in.
I don't think there's a single incident that doesn't carry some lesson learned, even if you're in another industry. Looking at things like NotPetya and watching how that proliferated globally. It wasn't originally targeted to hit the shipping industry, but Maersk still felt excruciating pain as a result of it anyway, right? So I would say in those types of circumstances, being able to understand any vulnerability that's ultimately created or exploited carries some degree of lessons. There's always something you can take from it.
And Jonathan's going to expand probably on the Ukraine event in 2015, but a lot of people don't realize the Ukraine event happened in 2015, 2016, and 2017. So, they've been hacked quite a bit. And there's a lot of people from our industry that has went over there and analyzed it in detail. INL is one example. I mean, and they went out and looked at that, and, to make sure to see how our compliance standards would protect us against that, so.
I think it was Marriott. Didn't take like 2 years to detect it. I think that would also be.
I thought Marriott happened back in September.
Yeah. I think one of the long lead ones was Heartbleed with Target was ongoing for a significant amount of time before they really figured it out. But it's not uncommon when vulnerabilities are discovered like that.
Yeah.
The average reporting time that DHS has for cyber incidents is 256 days from the time that they were breached to the time that it was discovered. And in more of half of those incidents, it was actually reported by an external entity, not the asset owner themselves, that there was some vulnerability in their system.
Yes, ma'am.
One other question, when you start talking about supply chain integrated, one of the things that comes to mind is natural gas and pipelines. How do you see these, the new SIP standards relating to them? How do you see pipeline cybersecurity coming into play? I know there's Bill 6175 and a lot of folks in the energy sector pay attention to that.
I can give the NERC response first. Currently, the pipeline isn't covered by the NERC.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Currently, the pipeline isn't covered by the NERC standards. However, there is some gray area with like blending stations and things that may be within a utility's footprint and within their fence that you may look at and say that's a 15-minute impact on a generation plant. So there's some gray area there that we know that there's an opportunity there, I'm not as well versed in the pipeline security. I know there's some recommendations and guidelines for them. We've had discussions with them during our CIPSI, Compliance Information or Protection Committee or something.
That all sounds right.
Yeah. We've had conversations with representatives from the pipeline group, and we actually asked them, what's their thoughts on mandatory standards like we have on
And I'm sure they
Yeah, right. Please more.
They were all over.
I'll hit a little bit of it when I go. So if there's still, and I'm sure there will still be some question marks there once I go, I'm happy to keep going with that one.
I'm glad you asked that because we did talk to Jonathan beforehand and said, please cover gas. And he said he'd written a paper, so he's our gas expert for today.
There we go.
So,
in the absence of a real one.
we view you as a real one.
I'll take it. That's
Okay.
great.
He's Army, so
That's right.
So that's all I had for my presentation. Is there any other questions? If there's other questions, then pull me aside.
I think you have any, okay.
Pull me aside. I'll give you my card, and if you got any
Yeah.
questions, let me know.
Also, I know you had walked in late, but if you're going for CLE, there's forms in the back, and there should be a CLE checking form. So.
Great. Well, thank you again for your comments, Lonnie, and thank you for being here. I'll just note for our audience, if there are additional questions that come up during Jonathan's presentation, either for Jonathan or perhaps for Lonnie, we'd be happy, speaking on Lonnie's behalf now, to take those as well. Turning to our second presenter today, and I guess just backing up real briefly, as Dave mentioned before, I'm Daniel Archuleta, from an attorney at Troutman Sanders, and just wanted to introduce Jonathan Munkin, Senior Director of System Resilience and Strategic Coordination at PJM. I'm positive that our audience already knows what PJM is, and Jonathan goes into a little bit more detail on his slide presentation, so I don't want to double up, but just real quick, PJM is the regional transmission organization that coordinates the movement of wholesale electricity in all or parts of 13 different states plus DC, covering large parts of the Midwest plus parts of the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic. Recognized by FERC as a neutral independent party, PJM operates the world's largest competitive wholesale electricity market and manages the high voltage electricity grid to ensure reliability for more than 65 million people. In addition to Jonathan's top secret security clearance, his day job as Senior Director at PJM, which he's been at for about 3 years, involves building enterprise level resilience in the areas of business continuity, physical and cybersecurity, risk management, operations, and planning. Prior to PJM, for about 2 years, Jonathan worked as a Vice President at the U.S. operations for the electric infrastructure security, where he worked with the government and the industry to develop best practices and capabilities to improve the resilience of life support infrastructure systems to widespread, long-duration power outages, also known as black sky events. And prior to that, Jonathan worked as Director of the Illinois Emergency Management Agency. All of which is to say a lot of experience and a wealth of perspectives that Jonathan brings to the table today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Terrific. Thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and to engage in the conversation. So I do intend to continue the thread that Lonnie started, which is it's a conversation by design. So feel free to ask questions, provide comments. I think that's what makes it most interesting, and hopefully hits the topics that you're particularly interested in. So it's the best of both worlds. So next slide, I'll do a very brief overview of PJM. So to your point, I think people are pretty familiar with who we are and what we do. So in terms of why we place a high level of importance on cybersecurity specifically, taking all of those operational figures into context, that about almost a quarter of the electricity consumed in the United States is through PJM. We're the second largest grid operator in the world. All of those things are to say something very interesting, which is despite those numbers, we actually have a very, very small physical footprint as a company. We don't own the generators. We don't own the substations. We don't own the transmission lines. We're the air traffic controller for the grid, making sure electrons aren't crashing into one another. So just like that, we don't own the planes or the runways. But what's important is that means while we have a small physical footprint, we have a massive IT footprint, recognizing that we have to connect all of these companies together, that we're collecting data for 5,600 substations and 1,600 generators and all of these assets in the bulk electric system that are making these things go on a day-to-day basis. So cybersecurity is a relative issue at PJM, is about as high as you can get on our list of priorities. So next slide, I want to just take this from a perspective of risk versus cost, because generally speaking, some of the comments that Lonnie had made about corporate networks versus operational networks or the energy management system, it would be great to have every protective system available and the best technology and the most people and everything on all of it. But realistically, that's just not a cost-effective means of approaching this entire cybersecurity process. So we really have to go through a deliberate process of risk management and identifying what is cost-effective and reasonable to protect. Next slide. So what I'll highlight here is just when we're looking at the spectrum of risks that have the ability to affect us really at a regional scale, because PJM's basics are not centered around kind of that last mile of the individual customer. We don't go all the way down to the meter or the individual house. It's really just about the preservation of the bulk electric system. These are the kind of risks that we consider, and there's plenty to choose from. There's no shortage of risks, but in terms of what we'll focus on today, cyber attack is definitely an interesting and unique one for two reasons that I'll highlight specifically. One is the fact that it's a targeted attack. So a hurricane is completely non-discriminate, right? It doesn't matter where it goes, it's just going to go where it's going to go, and things are going to be affected, and it's not necessarily, a hurricane is not designed for the purpose of maximizing the damage that's caused by it. It's just goes where it goes. Whereas cybersecurity is heavily targeted. It's really driven based on where the weak points are in the armor, or where the chinks are in the armor. So recognizing that makes it unique. The second thing is it completely ignores geographic boundaries. So you can't predict the path of it. You can't estimate where it's going to hit or when it's going to hit. The fact is, in the vast majority of instances, it's a no-notice event. It's on you before you realize it's there, and it can be everywhere at once. So that in and of itself makes it very unique. The other thing that I'll highlight off of this slide is this consideration of interdependencies. So there are significant interdependencies between the critical infrastructure systems that we operate on a day-to-day basis. So we'll talk about natural gas a little bit today. Communications is obviously the backbone of everything that we do. Given the level of automation that exists on the system now, you can't do all that without all these great fiber links and everything else that you need to provide you all that data in real time to do it. So those are a couple of things that I'll highlight as we go through today. Next slide. So where's the risk in the grid? Well, good news, everybody, it's everywhere. So every stage of the grid is something that has some degree of vulnerability to cybersecurity, and the threat vectors along each one of those areas of the grid is changing on a regular basis. But a couple of things that I'll highlight here. When we look at the residential at the bottom of the diagram, this is one that's changing quite rapidly, which is the demand profiles of individual users are changing because of Internet of Things or Internet connected devices, all the cool smart thermostats and all that stuff out there, even electric vehicles. We just hit 1 million electric vehicles in the United States just recently. Those types of things have the ability to change user behavior and load profiles in the system. And we have gone to great lengths of collecting decades of operational data to make the load forecast for the day ahead or the week ahead as accurate as possible. But as these behaviors change, these are elements or variables to the equation that are changing as well. And that in and of itself gives us a potential threat vector. How can you attack the grid without ever actually touching the grid itself? Interesting question. If it's 100 degrees today in the mid-Atlantic and a vulnerability is exploited on all of those cool smart thermostats, and somebody turns all of those thermostats down to 55 degrees at the same time, we can't handle that type of spike in load in the middle of the day. You just can't. You're going to have outages on the system and you never touch the grid. Even though we had the best protective systems possible on the energy management system, you never had to get there. So it raises a lot of interesting questions. Same thing with increased automation, smart meters, advanced metering information, that kind of good stuff. That's another line of communication that has now been established between higher elements of the grid and the individual user. So those things are interesting to consider. Opportunities, one might say. So at the substation level, you're talking about things like major components. Given the increase in automation at these locations as well, they're very largely unmanned. The vast majority of substations out there don't have any personnel working at them on a regular basis, have all kinds of cool automated controls, all of which have governing programmable logic software that's embedded in all of them. And those types of things, again, introduce an element of potential vulnerability in the system. And they're providing real-time data feeds. So how do you behave as the air traffic controller for the grid? Well, it's because you can see everything based on all this data that's coming back from substations. So to follow it back up the chain there to the last level, looking at PJM's perspective, we have the energy management system and all of these data feeds that we're receiving on a regular basis and using to make decisions on how we operate the grid. How do we keep it in balance? How do we economically dispatch generation resources? And what do we do to maintain our requirements as a reliability coordinator or balancing authority? The last element, and this is probably where we've seen within the energy sector, arguably the most churn, I guess, if you will, in terms of some of the targeting, is industrial control systems and SCADA at individual facilities, recognizing that that type of software, as was accurately highlighted by Lonnie, there's not a whole lot of providers out there, right? You're just talking about a handful of companies that write all of the SCADA code that's used for industrial control systems in all critical infrastructure sectors. It's a small group of companies. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's highly complex software. It's incredibly expensive to develop, And your user base, despite the fact that there are a lot of utility companies out there, is nowhere near the order of magnitude of the traditional software programs that you would think about when you're looking at things like Adobe or Microsoft or these really high profit margin type systems. So there's a reason why there aren't just thousands of companies playing in that space. It's a tough space to play in. Next slide. So we have some standards. Good news. We have some standards. What you're going to see here is a really long list of all of the standards that are specifically related to cybersecurity that we need to adhere to today. And there are more coming, as Lonnie highlighted. The end expectation is these are always going to evolve and update and change. And some of the things that I had mentioned before, when you talk about as we see it, this is the table stakes to play in the game. This is, as we see it organizationally, compliance is not the same thing as security. As we see it, that's the point of entry. You got to be this tall to ride this ride, right? And when you get there, and you should be there from a standard standpoint, you really got to figure out what you're doing above that to make sure that you're taking all the steps necessary to mitigate risk to the level that you should. So moving at the pace of adversaries. There is absolutely no shame in acknowledging that fact, because there is absolutely no one anywhere within any of these systems, the federal government or otherwise, that's always moving faster than the adversary. It's just, and that should not be the guidepost for standards either, saying we're going to make sure that standards move faster than the adversary. Well, odds are then you're probably going to implement a lot of bad standards in that environment, right? What you really should have is making sure that you're continually raising those stakes to play in the game, and recognizing that it's the sharing of best practices or information that gets us as close as we can be to the pace of adversaries, because they're not going to stop. They're not going to slow down. They're not going to wait for us to catch our breath. They're not going to call in sick today so that we know we don't have to protect the system on Sundays. They're going to be there. So I think it bears recognition, because it's important to understand in the risk environment how fast this is moving. The other thing is, at this moment in time, the standards don't include supply chain vulnerabilities. There are elements of it that are tucked in different parts of these standards, but as a dedicated standard, we're still working on getting there to develop it. We're on the path, we're working towards it, but what that really means is it doesn't absolve us of the responsibility. It's a significant risk, and it has to be considered as we procure new systems, as we update the systems that we have. All of those things have to be taken into consideration. When you look at the enormity and complexity of all of the elements that I mentioned on the previous slide, the number of vendors or organizations involved in that supply chain is a number that I would have a very difficult time even estimating, in the hundreds of thousands of different organizations that have some piece to that pie overall.
Can I have one input there?
Yeah.
There is a supply chain that has been approved by FERC, SIP 13. It's mandatory enforceable July 1st, 2020. So there is
2020.
So what's interesting, he mentioned about the number of vendors. You know, we did what they call small group advisory sessions, where we brought utilities in to answer the questions about supply chain. One of the large utilities come in, they have 20,000 vendors. So to Jonathan's point, when you start looking at 20,000 vendors, and this wasn't for the EMS network, for the SCADA network, but this was across their enterprise, they were assessing them all. So,
and that's one of the challenges that honestly asset owners look at right now, is say, well, what is the vetting criteria that I'm using at this point? And then what's really something that I can bake in? So the hard part is, if you have existing contracts with providers today, it's really, really hard. No vendor wants to go back in and reopen that contract and say, oh, by the way, I want all this other stuff bolted on, but I'm not going to pay another dollar for it because we've already agreed on a contract price. What I want is for you to incorporate all these safety protocols in your systems for nothing. Go for it. So it's not that they don't want their stuff to be safe. The hard part is they have to make an economic decision as well. So when we look at the as is and to be, there's a bridge there that really needs to be built to try and figure out how we make that happen. And because there are yet to have universally applied criteria for how you're bidding these contracts, or how you're really making a determination about how secure a particular vendor is, for 20,000 vendors to apply that same criteria, the time component of trying to do that would be absolutely crushing.
When you say 20,000, you're referring to vendors who supply some form of computer hardware, or
computer hardware services to that one industry participant, one registered entity.
Yeah, and the bigger the IT system that you're procuring, the more likely it is that any individual IT program could have at least 1,000 sub-vendors to it. That are
exclusive of other vendors you might sell them to trucks or
sure.
Cleaning supplies or
Yeah,
whatever.
that was my question.
Yeah.
Well,
You're gonna talk about landscaping contracts.
Yeah.
well, and the thing is, our first advice was focus on the BES. Yeah, you want to secure your corporate environment, but is your corporate environment going to impact the BES? That's what our concern is. So we went back and said, look at your numbers and see what you actually impact them.
Are you finding that the vendors or the owners is a business opportunity to proactively be able to demonstrate that they have these sort of protections built in?
Well, I mean,
you mentioned the hesitancy to go back in and say, hey, we're going to open this up and
Yeah.
provide all this for free. Well, some should be looking at it and saying this is a business opportunity to be the guy.
Yeah. So I think it can be demonstrated as a differentiator when you're talking about you're doing contract bid and competitive bidding against other vendors of saying, hey, here are all the security protocols that have been embedded in what we're offering you here today. The hard part is more often than not, consumer behavior, whether you're talking about a big company or an individual, is, well, it's $3 cheaper on Amazon and it's Prime eligible, so I can get it in 2 days. As compared to just driving over here, it might be a little bit more secure, but I'm not exactly how it's more secure, so I'm just going to go ahead and buy this thing. That's one of the things that you're challenged with, is saying, okay, you're going to need to pay more and wait longer, but hopefully it's going to be more secure. And how do you demonstrate the relative security of it if the type of procurement language is not clearly articulated in terms of what they're seeking? So ideally, we want vendors to see it the way you just described it. There's an economic opportunity here to be a secure resource, that to do the due diligence internally of saying our supply chain has been vetted with the following criteria, it has the following security protocols that are baked into it, and there's value assigned to that. The hard part is just figuring out what that looks like.
Any NERC subcommittee is looking to develop sort of standard contract language?
Well, I know that EEI, a trade group, was looking at, their legal group was looking for a standardized contract agreement that they were going to share with their members. But that's interesting, we saw, or at least I saw, an increase. I mean, I had small to medium-sized companies call me up and ask me, how can we become NERC certified for this supply chain? Right. Because they wanted to sell that and be able to go to the industry and say, we've already been vetted.
Good housekeeping seal of approval.
Yeah, we got this cert, and we're good. And, then we've got large companies that come to those advisory sessions and they ask the question, says, we're working with these large companies, Cisco, we're dropping the bucket. How are we going to drive change with the Cisco, with the Microsoft? They don't need our business.
Yeah, and the irony of it is, even from a company the size of PJM, comparatively speaking, even if we approached GE or OSI or one of those companies and said, hey man, you need to do this, we're still a drop in their bucket as well. So some of the things that we've done is we're part of what's called the ISO RTO Council, IRC, and we've worked collectively with the IRC to approach with a single voice some of the primary vendors that we use for our most critical systems and say, we all need this, not just PJM, not just ISO New England, not just MISO. We are going to come with a unified voice. We've already agreed that this is what we need to have, and approach the vendor as a single voice, which in and of itself is enormously helpful. But you can't do that with all 20,000 vendors, right? And you really need to figure out, the process of agreement is difficult.
Does NERC certify vendors?
No.
I don't think so.
No, we don't
Here's
certify
what I'm
vendors. We don't certify vendors. We don't provide, but there's
the company line and I are going to start together. Business opportunity.
But it's interesting because you mentioned, the ISO council and everything. There's other groups that do that as well. So like the Transmission Forum, and they have the EI. We told them groups by numbers. You have to approach it. One utility going to a Cisco means nothing, but you got a couple hundred from going in. It's a lot different.
Yeah, for sure. The next slide is really just talking about risk versus cost. So this is an Accenture report on cybersecurity, just getting an idea of what the average cost to companies is for cybersecurity. So keep in mind what this is the cost associated with very specific either programs, technology, or software used for cybersecurity purposes. It doesn't really even capture what I would describe as kind of the soft costs of cybersecurity, recognizing that from a personnel standpoint and everything else, there are so many more things that you could potentially include in terms of your IT systems, your hardware, all that kind of stuff. That's not just about, well, this person works on my cybersecurity team, or this is a FireEye product that I'm using to do this particular cybersecurity task. So what you're really seeing here is a dramatic increase. So just over the course of the last 5 years, there's a 62% increase in the average cost to each company, the average company, for cybersecurity. And I don't think any critical infrastructure industry company is an exception to that rule, and I wouldn't be entirely surprised to see the average be higher in critical infrastructure. It really just comes down to trying to make those decisions. What is the cost of not doing this, or what is the cost of not having this type of protection? Next slide. So a lot of this is really driven based on the threat environment that we find ourselves in. And as I mentioned before, the pace of adversary advancement from a technology perspective is very, very fast. But it bears mentioning that the spectrum of threats that we have to contend with goes a long way to trying to figure out what we're protecting on our system, to what degree or what level we're protecting it, and that whole concept around defense in depth. Next slide. So this is kind of the universe of threats that we look at from a cybersecurity perspective. Is you have your nation state threats, right? The full capabilities of foreign adversaries that really have a unique motivation when they're looking at it. They have the financial resources, the technical expertise, and arguably as important, the time to just navigate these IT architectures, figure out what's going on inside of these systems. The breaches that we mentioned before about, people haven't been detected for 6 months. Cyber criminals are looking for a quick score. They're not looking to hang out in your system for 6 months, waiting to try and find some type of new vulnerability. They need to make their share of that multi-billion-dollar industry that's out there and move on to the next thing. So nation state threats have potentially the political motives or military motives to be able to use these types of exploitations in a very real sense. Again, it's not about shutting down the grid for a day to make a buck, although there are certainly ways to do that, but it's really trying to achieve some type of geopolitical end state. Unattributable threat actors is what we see with by far the greatest volume on our system on average. These are the cyber criminals that are doing constant reconnaissance based on algorithms developed with known vulnerabilities that are in commonly used software systems. So whether it's Adobe Flash Player or whatever it is, go on the dark web, find a vulnerability that's present in a lot of different software programs, do a sweep of the internet trying to find it, and see if you can exploit a vulnerability for the purpose of either embedding something like ransomware so that you can generate some quick money, or something that you could potentially sell to a nation state actor. That's one of your best customers. If you find you're just trying to do the shotgun, I'm going to hit as many people as I can, but if I just so happen to expose a vulnerability for somebody who works in the utility industry, I know what customer I have out there that I can sell that vulnerability to. So more often than not, it's not about brute force hacking for nation state actors. It's about being able to gobble up those vulnerabilities that are already being exposed, and that low-hanging fruit that's easier for them to then take and run with for an extended period of time until they get where they want to get with it. The last one is certainly a significant risk, which is insider threats. The biggest problem with insider threats is they're already authorized to be in your system, right? They're already on the other side of that awesome firewall and those cool protective tools and everything else that you have. They have permission to be there, and they have a knowledge of how your system works. So that in and of itself makes it a significant risk for us, but you can see why you can't do this one way. You have the volume game in the middle of saying, my system is getting touched all the time by people that are conducting this type of high-level reconnaissance for typically economic benefit. You have these very technologically advanced nation-state scale threat actors that are just trying to slowly and quietly move through your system until they get somewhere that's really valuable, and then they'll just hang out there until it's time to use it. And then you have the folks that are already on your system that have the knowledge and the access to be able to do significant harm. So this is not this is how I'm going to approach it, and that's the only way you need to worry about it. You really need to think of the whole ecosystem of threats.
I thought organized crime was also a big threat. That might be under unattributable.
It is, yeah.
Not to get political, but Donald Trump talked about the 400-pound guy sitting on the bed.
Yeah.
So I guess you got both the lone wolf.
Absolutely. absolutely. And for organized crime, the outcome is money, right? They're not trying to start a war with the United States or any other country. Their primary objective there is to make money, just like any criminal enterprise. And so it should not come as a significant shock that the coordination of effort between organized crime organizations that focus on things like identity theft or credential theft are very much in constant contact with nation-state threat actors. Who's willing to pay me the most for this particular vulnerability that I found?
You know, it's interesting, Jonathan mentioned time and money. In the cybersecurity world, you give me enough time, enough money, anything's hackable. It's just the drive. That's what it comes down to, that third factor of what's the end goal.
Yeah, and if you're really willing to invest the time and effort in it, you can bring about just about any consequence on any system. But the hard part is just how much time and capability do you have to apply to that particular problem. So that in and of itself makes it very difficult. And we don't necessarily see nation-state actors within our systems on such a regular basis like we do with unattributable threat actors. So it's one of those things that you're very well practiced at looking at the thing that you see with the highest volume and greatest frequency, and less experience dealing with the most sophisticated threat actors that are potentially trying to gain access to your system. And that's where that partnership with the government is very, very important. We can't do it alone, right? Our companies are not designed to fight Russia, right? That's not how it works for us. But working with those who do, that's beneficial.
On the inside threats, background checks and that sort of thing, I guess, you don't let them in the front door.
Sure.
But once they're in, are there other things you use to?
Sure. Yeah, so we use behavioral threat analytics inside of our own organization to try and build out overall threat profiles for everybody in the company. So I have a dedicated threat profile number, which they don't tell me, for my own organization. And that's based on a combination of behavior from a physical and cyber perspective. So where I move on the campus and when I do, because I'm swiping as I go through every single door, that builds out a risk profile for individuals. Have I attempted to swipe in areas that I know I don't have access to or shouldn't have access to? Have I tried repeatedly at the same room? Have I tried a half dozen different rooms that no reasonable person would assume that they should have access to? Those types of things can help build out a profile. And then anytime you're using a work device, and I'm sure every lawyer can back me up in this particular room, you automatically, through agreements with your employees, give up a degree of privacy when you're using those corporate-owned resources. So whether it's my mobile phone, my laptop, tablet, whatever it is that your company provides to you, you are consenting to being monitored while you're using those resources. And all of those things can build out an aggregated risk score for employees that say, there are some folks we should probably watch a little bit more closely than others for these behavioral reasons.
And what's interesting about that, in the NERC mandatory standards of compliance, it's the background check and training. That's all that's required.
Right.
The stuff, everything that's above and beyond is looked at as a positive for utilities. It isn't required by standards. That's where I go back to, do you monitor your traffic going out of your network? The insider threat, there's always a channel out. And we got standards that cover about ports and services, about the USBs being able to prevent that data leakage, right? And then we got network controls, but going above and beyond that is compliance sets that low bar.
Track what he's sending out, such that you can fall in that profile you're talking about.
Sure.
In terms of swiping doors and other.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Anything's possible. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Next slide. So I won't go too deep into this, but the reason that 2015 was a watershed moment for the critical infrastructure industry is that prior to this intrusion and this compromise, it was widely thought that the bridge between IT and OT, so information technology systems and operations technology systems, was significant enough that an IT compromise would not likely result in a physical grid outage. Well, surprise, it's possible, right? Well, I think there's a variety of different reasons. One is that there's a general sense that the time it takes to be able to do it and the process that it takes to move from IT to OT, that eventually, before you can get far enough into the system, enough of these layers of defense will detect it. that the time necessary, the sophistication necessary to do it, it'll allow enough opportunities for defense in depth to be able to pick it out. Now, in this particular instance, it was almost 9 months present in the system before they got far enough that they could actually execute what they wanted to. The other thing is there was a general sense that it would require some type of deliberate insider coordination to make it happen, i.e. Stuxnet, right? You can do it if you have somebody on the inside that's willing to plug something in for you. In this particular instance, it was just the good old fundamentals of spear phishing, right? Here's an email with malicious code on it, right? You got to make sure that, you know, and somebody clicked on something and that established the necessary foothold that set up 9 months worth of work to get to where they wanted to be. So those types of things is that the relative low level sophistication of the initial attack indicated to a lot of people, like, you know what, that's never going to make it all the way to the energy management system. But obviously those things were proven wrong in spades. And as somebody mentioned before, that wasn't their last rodeo either in terms of how many times the Ukrainian power grid has experienced those kind of failures. So, you know, at this point, they're still terrified to plug a network cable into the wall. And they've primarily been operating manually since 2015. Yep. So they're still throwing breakers by hand.
You know, I have a little bit of experience. Prior to NERC, and I worked in one of the regions, CERC, for several years. I spent 9 years consulting. And I was hired from numerous utilities to do pen testing, and that includes physical pen testing. And one of the things that I performed was a pen test. I did spear phishing. I found a group of users on their corporate website, sent them emails, told them their IT, their vacation balance may be wrong. We simulated an IT site because we were on the inside of their network in no time, and sent it to 30 users. Within 10 minutes, I had 30 username passwords on the corporate network. And just so happened we had access to the OT network, and 20-some% of those, or 20 of the 30 worked on the OT network as well. Same password, same username, everything. So within 3 or 4 hours, I had access to their IT network and OT network. And this utility claimed they were the top-notch security.
It wasn't us, by the way.
No, I'm not going to release all that. It was very alarming to them because within 4 hours, we broke their entire cybersecurity program down to you're compromised. And those accounts, there were several of them that were administrative root level that I can make modifications on anything. So, you know, not only it does happen across the country, but it happens here. It can happen in a heartbeat. But go ahead.
Doesn't everybody feel warm and fuzzy now?
Yeah.
So next slide, please. Yeah, that's right, exactly. Ever again. Yeah, so, and there's a lot of, and this is another one of those examples of compliance versus what are you doing on top of it. You know, so we have a spear phishing program that we have. So if you see, you know, if you get an email that looks suspicious, there's a button on your Outlink window, you just hit it, it automatically sends it to the security team for review. Because a lot of times you see it, and normally what employees will do, understandably, is if you're aware and you see it and you say, no, that looks bogus, you're just going to delete it, right? You look at it and you just delete it. You move on and you say, there you go, I kept my company safe. That's a good start, but ideally what you want to be able to do is if the security team has an opportunity to review what the malicious code was that was potentially embedded in that email, it helps design and update your security protocols for your company. So that if somebody does click on it in the future, if somebody wasn't as aware, then you're already protected against it because there's a known vulnerability on your system, and you know whether it's the IP address that spear phishing email originated from or anything else, it gives you more insight into the security systems. The other thing we do is we phish our own employees. So our security team generates spear phishing attacks and starts attacking our own employees. And then we monitor how our internal compliance based on who clicks, how often, all that kind of good stuff. And it even tracks if you delete it versus hit the button to say, well, it's good but not great. I'm glad you deleted it and didn't open it, but what you really should have done is sent it to
You circle back and let them know they passed the test.
Our employee compensation is tied to your performance on spear phishing. And you click through too many times, we'll dock your bonus. You know, we take it very seriously.
NERC has,
yeah, exactly.
NERC has that program as well, and we got an incentive that, you know, every quarter we have spear phishing campaigns at NERC that they test us. And some of the ones you look at are really good.
Oh,
you know?
yeah, they're great.
And there's people on my team, cybersecurity people, hey, new laptop. Everybody's getting a new laptop. Click.
Yep.
And it happens. And we get bonuses quarterly based on the percentage across NERC. And, you know, it happens. I mean,
It's hard to make it more personal than tying it to your compensation.
Is
So.
there immediate though?
Yeah.
An email back within 24 hours saying you made a mistake on this.
Oh, no, you'll know if it's one that they developed specifically, that our security team developed, you'll know instantly as soon as you hit anything. whether
sometimes
it's
you
on
get directed to a website that you have to take mandatory training. Some utilities have programs there.
Yep.
That you click on it, it doesn't take you to whatever site.
I know of one utility that actually has I know one company that actually has a fishing parking lot that's about a half a mile away from the building. So if you click through, you have to park in the remote parking lot and you walk the walk of shame to work every day. And you have to do that for a month after you click. So for a month now, you're walking. And everybody, whoever's walking on that sidewalk, you know, they clicked and they weren't, so there's, shame is a powerful tool. So there's a lot of ways to get there. There's a lot of ways to get there. So from a defensive standpoint, you know, the type of things that we can potentially do here, it really runs the gamut. There's a lot of different ways to tackle this cybersecurity question. So as I mentioned before, information sharing is hugely important. It's entirely trust-based. There are existing mechanisms for it. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal. But suffice to say, if I was going to place a high priority on anything on this slide, information sharing is right up there, because it's one of those things that evens out the playing field on that speed of the adversity thing that we mentioned before. And the hard part is, it's kind of like the program at NASA that looks for asteroids that have a potential for collision with Earth. It's a really big sky, right? And if you don't know which direction to look in, right, your odds of actually spotting that thing before it gets really close to you is very, very low. Same thing is true from a cyber perspective. So if you can help narrow the view down significantly, that's what information sharing does. Data management is a big one, which is it includes network segmentation, where is data stored within your system based on its relative importance, or being able to purge data on a regular basis, which is something that all companies should certainly consider. On the utility side, take somebody that actually touches customers. We don't touch customers as a company. We don't bill anybody or do any of that kind of stuff. But if you're doing customer billing, you should ask important questions like, do we store social security numbers for customers? And the question should be, why? Do you actually need social security numbers in order to accurately bill customers? How often do you purge customer data? It could be that somebody who moved out of your service territory and no longer pays you a bill, their personal information is in your system for 10 years. Why? Do you really need that? What is the procedure for storing and maintaining data? Data is really typically the driver as to the relative targeting of adversaries to your system, especially in that cyber criminal space. The more data you are known or perceived to have in your system, the better target you are. So the less that you have, the better, generally speaking. Vulnerability management, this is one of those kind of basics of you got to make sure that you're doing your security patching and you're doing it the right way. So an interesting thing, when you get an update for your iPhone, 12.1 is available, right? And you just keep getting the reminder, right? They're just going to keep beating you up until finally you just submit. And you say, fine, I'm plugged in and I'm connected to Wi-Fi. I will do the update that you're begging me to do. Well, our security team reviews iPhone updates every time, and they'll say, 12.1 was released today. Don't touch your phone or do any updates until we give you the go-ahead. Why? Well, because as soon as 12.1 comes out, there's a million nerds just banging away at that thing, trying to find any vulnerability that they can, which is why 12.1.1 comes out like 3 days later, right? Because they find vulnerabilities, not because they wanted them there, but because millions and millions of lines of code are going to have vulnerabilities in it. So doing your proactive patching is a big part of how we do it. And there's plenty of other things that we do. We talked about predictive analytics, technology lifecycle, replacements of assets, taking a security approach to that kind of thing. Could be that you bought that device in your system 10 years ago, well before all of these security procedures were well known. And as you're updating it, you should do it.
On the patching.
Yeah.
You triggered a thought in my mind. So you say wait 3 days or so to get the bugs out and get to 1.1 version. There's a time period in there for like 35 days or
35 days.
Do you actually prefer that we wait to day 30 or for that reason, or Or is that why they gave 30?
Well, you know, you have 35 days to assess it, and that's released from your patch source, right? And then you have 35 days from that assessment to install. What I recommend is listen to your patch source. Many times your patch source is your EMS vendor or someone who's supporting your system. They put that through the gauntlet and test it and check it for vulnerabilities, make sure it's working. I'm not one that's going to ever recommend that the day the patch comes out from Microsoft, install it, because you're going to break something. Is it, you know?
And it might not even be because the patch is bad, just there's a number of times we have to install a patch and then back it out because it had an unintended effect on other systems.
A new feature.
New feature.
and the compatibility, it may not work with what you're trying to do with your system.
Yep.
You know, I'm not one that, you know, and this is something they're looking to get rid of in the SIP modifications, is that 35-day of patching. What they're looking to do is patch, you know, how we're doing compliance oversight more based on risk. Well, they want to, the FDT is looking to patch more based on risk as well. So not only about the impact of the system, but the vulnerability and the risk of installing it and looking at the risk of the system. So that's one of the
unintended consequences.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so waiting the full time, the time in and of itself is a component, but if you're looking at it from a risk perspective, it's probably the least valuable variable in that particular equation, because just because it's been 30 days doesn't necessarily mean it's that much better. It's a variable, but some organizations have their own testing environments that they have designed for specific software systems. You can't do that for all of them, but you may have it. Some of it's the vendor themselves that they have a test environment that they use, and you should expect that or contract for that to make sure that there's a certain timeline that's associated with whatever your compliance requirements are to really do the vulnerability testing on that particular resource. So there's a lot of ways to get there, but I wouldn't necessarily just assign time value as the sole driver for when the relative best time is to do the update. For us, it's a lot easier to be able to say, I'm just going to wait. I don't update my personal phone until I get the email from our security team that says, go ahead and update all of your devices now. You know, 12.1 is approved for installation on your devices. I just wait until I get that email and do it on my own.
What's interesting, NERC has the same policy. Our IT, we don't update it, our company sponsored phone until we get it from IT.
There you go. Next slide, please. So this one is just kind of getting an understanding of what we call the cyber kill chain. It's called that because it sounds cool, obviously, and we want to make cybersecurity sound awesome. So the kill chain is really just giving you a sense of the severity and capability of a cyber intrusion from least to most, working left to right on this. The reconnaissance phase of it is something you can't stop from happening. Reconnaissance is going to be, anything that's internet connected is going to be reconnoitered on a regular basis. So this is what I alluded to earlier when people are developing algorithms that are searching internet connected devices for known software vulnerabilities. That's going to happen all the time. We don't even try and keep track of that type of statistic because it's impossible, honestly. Like somebody's going to reconnoiter your system on a regular basis, but it's just really looking at all those things that are signaling back and forth with the internet. Delivery is, as we say, it's the delivery of the weaponized package, which again, it's just a fancy way of saying, as soon as that spear phishing email gets to your inbox, that's the delivery of a weaponized package. Doesn't mean that it's been opened yet. It just means that it's sitting there. It's been delivered by whoever wanted to get it there. Exploitation is when you actually run the weaponized package. That is, you accidentally clicked on this link because you definitely thought you were going to get a free laptop when you did. So that's the exploitation is the first step at which you have malware installed on your system, physically present on your system. And so at that point, it doesn't mean that you click on the link and 4 seconds later, 65 million people lose power, right? That's not really how it works. But what it means is malware is designed to do one very specific thing. Each malware is designed to do something a little bit different. And all of it is associated with being able to move to the next stage, which is installation. And this is the first time at which there's persistent access to the system, which means there's two-way communication. Malware is meaningless if it doesn't have some form of data exfiltration capability or external communication capability. If I can't talk to it and give it any additional commands, its impact is going to be very minimal, if at all, right? It means it's there, and if I can ever establish a two-way communication with it to tell it to do more than what I originally designed it to do, that's what the circumstance you're trying to avoid. And that's where, when you're doing network monitoring, you're saying, that's weird, there's a little signal coming out, this port's open, or this signal's coming out right now, and it's going to an IP address that's not something that we authorize a connection to, or it's traffic that is not tied to any other workstation or protocol that we're familiar with. C2 is the command and control, and this is the point at which it's not just about two-way communication. I can start doing stuff with your workstation. I can start taking action with it and start communicating with your network, your internal network now. And the last stage of it is actions, which is kind of the Ukraine example, right? The grid operator sits down, the cursor's moving across the screen, and they're not touching their mouse. That's a really bad day, right? That's a really, really bad day. And this is when you're exercising full command and control over somebody's system.
Yeah, we're running a little short on time.
Yeah.
Move over to gas stuff.
Yeah, we could totally do that. So the next slide is around incident reporting, which is going to change. Right now, the hard part is kind of the thresholding of incidents that you're reporting. And right now, our primary requirement is OE 417, the Department of Energy, which really requires some type of operational effect before you're required to submit it. But needless to say, in the spectrum of cyber intrusions and effects, that's a pretty high threshold for event reporting. So that in and of itself means that there's a lot of stuff that could potentially happen at companies that largely goes unreported for a variety of different reasons. Next slide. This is just getting a sense around response capabilities. Suffice to say, this is not the worst case scenario is standing on your own, right? There are industry capabilities in-house to individual companies. There are industry capabilities like cyber mutual assistance within the electricity industry where we can share resources with one another. There's the possibility of contracted support, which is a fairly common thing, especially depending on the internal resources of a company. It's likely that they have some type of external contract. Hey, if something really bad happens, I hope you show up as soon as possible and help me remediate this problem because I don't have in-house expertise. And then the questions around what you can do from a government perspective. So DHS ICS CERT, which is not called that anymore, right? They just changed it. It's called HERT teams. You could potentially ask for government assistance to help remediate a cyber threat. Next slide. So let's talk about those multi-sector challenges. Next slide. So I think we hit supply chain pretty well, but suffice to say, an important thing to recognize is that we can talk about supply chain within the electricity industry, but you cannot underestimate the importance of supply chain vulnerabilities across infrastructure sectors. So the OSI soft breach that was just disclosed this week and Lonnie referenced earlier. OSI develops PI software, data collection software, not just for the electricity industry, but every critical infrastructure industry in the United States. So natural gas, water systems, telecommunications, it's a foundational software program for things that transcend any individual sector. That is the reason why this supply chain issue is so important, is that the vendors that develop primary systems that we use in the electricity industry, it's the same vendors that are being used in other industries as well. Next slide. So real quick as to why this is a growing issue in terms of its relative importance. This is just a snapshot of the generation mix by fuel type inside the PJM territory. So what you see on the left side of this slide is where we sit today. And we have, by rough orders of magnitude, we're sitting at a fairly even dispersal of coal, nuclear, and natural gas with a smattering of other things that are in there. But what you're seeing on the right is if we forecast out to 2022 and look 5 years out, what you see is a dramatic shift where natural gas suddenly becomes about half of all of the fuel that's supplying bulk generation in our system. So if you're talking about interdependencies, that's a rapidly growing interdependency. So the concepts around the potential fuel security of those resources is not to say that the natural gas system isn't highly reliable. It is. It's extremely reliable, right? They have a great track record of making sure that they can deliver to their customers in a variety of different circumstances. Next slide. So PJM just published a fuel security study just a couple of weeks ago. It'll be available in full form December 17th, but a summary of it was provided a couple of weeks ago. And what you're looking at is one of the outcomes of more than 300 scenarios that we ran, looking at the combined effects of anticipated retirements of legacy resources on the system, and then operating conditions that are, as we would describe them, extreme but plausible. So specifically looking at cold weather conditions that mirror the types of things that we saw during the polar vortex and the bomb cyclone and every other super cool winter weather term that you can come up with. And the idea here is that's when the gas system, as an example, is the most constrained. Consumer demand at individual houses is high, just like it is in the power system, because we have high load profile during those types of days. So if you combine all of those nasty effects, what you have is a circumstance where you get into kind of the pink on this, where you have load shed as a result of the lack of availability of generation. Keep in mind, the next stage of this study is to look at the potential consequences of physical or cyber disruption scenarios to the bulk delivery system of natural gas. This does not include that. This is just significant operating constraints brought about by severe weather and anticipated retirements of assets on our system. So if you look at that and say, well, what if I layered a cyber disruption to the system? You could have a very, very significant consequence. Now, pipeline systems take cybersecurity very seriously, just like we do. They don't have mandatory enforceable standards. They have voluntary standards that are developed by TSA. A little known fact, right, that same government department that does airport security also has security standards for pipelines. Very interesting. But for us, it's really just a matter of being able to collaborate with the gas industry on some of those best practices. So the next slide is really talking about some of these cybersecurity partnerships. And so there are several that are out there, but what I'm going to focus on is the box that's in green there. So just like we have the EISAC for the electricity sector, the DNG ISAC is the Downstream Natural Gas Information Sharing and Analysis Center. And the other circle that's in there is the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity Communications Integration Center at the Department of Homeland Security. So those are entities that are designed specifically for the purpose of sharing threat intelligence between each of those sectors that they represent. That's our conduit to find out. So if there's a vulnerability in the gas industry, it'll work its way through those channels and is made available through the ISAC to us. So it's a great process that absolutely needs to be in place, but it raises those types of questions of how fast did that process happen, how valuable is the information that was provided to us, and what capability do we have to remediate those types of issues. So there's a lot that needs to be unpacked when we look at these interdependencies, but this is a great place to start.
What's considered downstream natural gas? Is that transmission and distribution?
So yeah, technically it includes, so it's basically anything past the actual like refinement and
Production area.
production. Yep, so it includes anybody that's represented by like INGA, the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America, AGA that handles kind of the distribution level, or the local distribution companies. Now, both of those things are voluntary,
Right.
just like the ISAC is. So not every utility in the United States, electricity utility, is a full-fledged member of the ISAC. It's based on their ability to do it. So that's all I have. Look forward to questions, comments, complaints, conversation.
So I have a question. I mean, this is for Lonnie more, maybe more for Jonathan. That is, when you were talking about, you were asked a question about natural gas, how it relates to the supply chain standards. For example, an electric generator, gas-fired generator, sometimes owns its own meter station. Is that meter considered, and then the valve associated with it considered part of its BES facilities, or is
It could be.
part of the supply chain?
Good answer. Good answer.
It's not part of the supply chain, but it would fall back to SIP 2, which is around the identification and classification of essential BES assets. And that's where there's some discussion right now because many utilities, that's always been out of scope for SIP. But if you look at it, is there a 15-minute impact if they lose that valve? Of course there is. But currently,
It's not run perfectly well, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I never needed it in the first place.
and see, and it's interesting. He talked about the fuel mix. You know, going from coal, everybody says, "Oh, I have enough coal in my hopper for
60
hours
days or whatever.
Hours of running, 10 hours of running, and so it's not, the hopper's out of scope. But when you start talking about natural gas at blending stations, stuff like that, could it be? Yes. Possibly.
Possible. And that's the same kind of dependency, right? The presence of automation on delivery systems for electricity and natural gas are very similar in terms of how prevalent they are now. What I will say is that there's certainly a greater capability of manual functionality for the pipeline system than there is for the grid. So from a relative risk perspective, they have a much greater capability to go manual than the grid does. So doing what PJM does manually, yeah, not so much.
But see, what's interesting, Mike, is we've been asked that question before, and where does it stop? Does it stop a mile down the road? And, you know,
Yep.
Because that's a 15-minute impact.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's not without impact, right?
Mm. No comment.
Yeah. There you go. Oh, look at the time. Oh, have a good weekend, everybody. Yeah, there you go. Good questions. Good comments.
Yeah, that's
Great presentation, both.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
very good.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Hope it was helpful. All right.
Anybody have any more questions? I think we got to wrap it up. I guess,
Yeah.
we're just sticking out for a few minutes.
You bet.
Come up and chat with them.
And for the folks on the phone, I'm sorry they missed the prime rib carving station and the bottomless mimosas was a really nice touch for today. Thank you.